Hello and welcome to week 5 in Psychology of Personality, and what a great group you are. I'm totally enjoying the work that you're submitting, and it's just a thrill. Some really good stuff. We enter into a chapter we need to, the field of psychology really needs to spend a lot more time talking about not only the psychology of women, but the contribution of women psychologists. Like in almost all of the sciences, there's a whole period of time when women were excluded from that dialogue. It didn't stop some of them. You got to imagine it probably stopped a lot of them, but certainly there are some characters, we could call them heroes, really, who went forward and just kept on doing it and pretty much paved the way for psychology to not really just be a gender-oriented thing. But we're moving from Freud into some, sort of neo-Freudian, into the psychology of women. And again, I may have mentioned, and certainly mentioned it in different places, different contexts, that a lot of modern psychology is either a building upon or a rejection against Freud. Now, at the same time Freud was coming out, we also had behaviorism. That was kind of like a battleground, and those are almost like the big, huge divisions within the field of psychology can be drawn along those lines. But then we start looking at the impact of Freud. Not only did he have some great things like our discussions about defense mechanisms that we just got through and people's identification of those, and just very pragmatic ways to describe these experiences. He was also a person of his times. He was sexist, what we would call sexist. He thought that women were the weaker of the species in human beings, and all kinds of ways in which just about everybody thought about women that way. Yet he had women who were followers. Now, keeping in mind, in that day, not everyone who was a woman necessarily rejected that notion. Some of them, well, that's the way of the world. They didn't really have anything to say about it anyway, so they went along with it. Or maybe they truly believed it. And Freud's followers, his daughter included, bought into this idea, but they started to look at things a little bit differently, particularly from that unique perspective of being women themselves within this world predominated by Freud's theories. Now, in the psychology of women, we're going to look at this crazy notion of sexuality and gender being central to everything. I want to make sure that you understand this within its context then, but also looking at it now. There's a great video on the portrayal of women in advertising called "Killing Us Softly." It's a great, if you get any one of them, I think there's 4 different versions of it now. It's been updated, and one of the characteristics that's presented by the lead researcher in that video is that sex is both everything and nothing at the same time in advertising. It's both, in our society, it's either like, no, sexuality is not part of anything, it's not part of our job, it's not part of anything, but yet advertising and motivation and whatnot very closely tied to sexuality. So there's a sort of dichotomous aspect to sexuality, and now gender's taking a place in there without shaming any aspect of gender politics or gender identity or all of those things. It is laying within our social world in the same way sexuality did. It's either everything or it's nothing. And finding those balances and so we can live valid, authentic lives, so we can be who we are, express who we are, and be able to identify as the person we truly are, while at the same time not making it the overriding issue of, we're a little ways from that happening. Now, without necessarily going down that particular rabbit hole. I'm going to ask you to think about the notion of the beginnings of psychology, where gender and sexuality, according to Freud, that was the driving force of motivation. You would see his theory was called the psychosexual theory. Now, you have to understand the original writings to get your head wrapped around that, because he wasn't talking about infants having adult sexual types of motivations, but the energy that would then become sexuality later in life exists throughout our lifespan and was a source of motivation. Contrary to that, little heads up here for Erik Erikson. So you had the psychosexual stages of development. Erikson came along and created, even coining the term psychosocial. And I know most of you are aware of that term, psychosocial, social interaction, and the quest of a balance between what the world wants me to do and what I want to do. Essentially, the building up of the superego. Erikson was a student of Freud, and so, moving from sexuality, which is the center of a lot of those things, into more the social world, which much more represents where we are today. So we moved away. We may even validate those internal energies, and certainly when we're talking about sexuality itself, we need to look at those realities of sex drive, pleasure, interaction, intimacy, all of those things, and of course diversities within sexuality. But we, as a more modern society, we look more of those social factors in terms of interactions with other people. A little bit more sociology going on, which I think is probably good. So in the first of two discussions, we have an exploration of sexuality and gender being central, and what's that like today? This is a wide open discussion to anything I've just talked about. Please be kind to each other and respect the diversity as you have been in this class. I trip over myself all the time. I have students calling me out for all kinds of mistakes that I make. So if I ever say anything that seems a little off, just send me an email and I'm guaranteed I will apologize. The second discussion has to do about relational cultural theory that we see coming out of this, and we see that movement, a slight movement within the field away from this internal thing being, the id, ego, and superego, and dealing with sexual energy and all that being central. It's like, oh, wait a minute, what are all these other interactions that we're having, and really moving toward what will become a psychology of women, the field itself. And in the quiz, I'm asking you to reflect on how boys and girls experience sexuality different. Now, this is coming from a context for me. In my developmental psych class, I really enjoy the conversations that we have about early and late development and how it applies to adolescence. Now, there are predictable outcomes to early developing girls versus late developing girls, early developing boys, late developing boys, in terms of the later onset of secondary sexual characteristics such as pubic hair and breasts and facial hair and muscle structure and growing tall, and all of those things. And those dynamics play along with the expectations of what goes on in a particular age, and it produces some very, very different experiences of sexuality. And that can really, really bring some interesting conversation to the table. And how women are portrayed as sexual beings versus how men are portrayed as sexual beings, about expectations for each one of them, those kinds of things. Let's just open up that dialogue again here. Grabbing some information from the chapter, but also talking about our real world experiences. This is not meant to be a deep exploration of your own personal journey. With that, be kind. That's something certainly that people can share, but go light on the details. I want to keep, at least let's keep it rated R at the most. Nothing really, really detailed. But personal experience obviously plays a lot in that. In my own life, I'll go first. In my own life, my oldest brother was very early developing, very athletic. In 8th grade, he was playing varsity sports. I was extremely late developing. I looked like a little boy for a really, really long time. I was still athletic. I was still, doing those things because I grew up in that kind of family. But our lived experiences of and how we actually grew up are dynamically different. The beginning of our sexual lives, dynamically different. The pathway of our sexual lives, dynamically different between me and my older brother. So those things are real in terms of our personal experiences and also how they define us as we're making our way through the social world, which has its own expectations and whatnot. So that, the short of it, I will see you in those discussions. They're dynamic, really cool stuff. Let's embrace this as personality. We're still talking about personality, but now we're talking about personality as it relates. And the women of the early women started putting this on the table, saying, wait a minute, we got all these stuff going on inside, but we're also interacting with others. And that's playing a role in the development of our personality. Go women, to bring the men along to get that idea into them. It's not all in there. It's these social interactions as well. So I'll see you this week. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the discussions.